Well, hello everybody. So welcome or welcome back to this place, which is all about furniture from the past and shedding some light on the mysterious subject. A little bit too much light, some say, but there are UV filters on the windows, so don't worry about these 240-year-old pieces. I am going to have to wear sunglasses though, because today we will be focusing on this piece, which commemorates the importance of Atlantic port cities during the glory days of European commerce with the New World. The New World where, ironically, the piece finds itself now. And so we're going to ignore the small one here, although they are both relevant to this series on French armoires, which will preserve digital traces of the more iconic ones around here, but which moreover seeks to outline some of the basic criteria for their real collectability. Because, you know, all of these big old pieces are very impressive, but we really have to look past their size into the details of quality and artistic value present in only a select few. And so firstly, armoire comes from the Latin armarium, meaning the place where the arms are kept. And it's one of the oldest types of furniture in history. So although this was never a weapons cabinet, this etymology helps us visualize these grand 18th century models more as presentation cabinets, perhaps centerpieces of the home, and not necessarily something relegated to a dark bedroom. And with a piece like this from the 1780s, we are dealing with something that predates that year 1840, after which industrialization generally diminished the art of furniture. And for furniture enthusiasts, something like this is already a quintessentially recognizable example of port furniture from the port of Bordeaux, made out of solid mahogany, you know, this exotic wood that would arrive into the ports from the Caribbean. But anybody can pan their vision across the flat surfaces here to see the undulations left by the sculptor, these subtle indications, simple indications of hand manufacture. But we aren't just interested in armoires from this rare pre-industrial timeline. We're looking for ones that are emblematic of their city or region of origin. And this gets pretty close to the height of style and quality produced in Bordeaux at the time, which does mean that, like most French armoires, it falls under the wide umbrella of provincial or non-Parisian furniture. But here, we're really distinguishing between an outstanding regional city work made for the city mansions or the chateaux surrounding Bordeaux, and rustic country furniture, although both would technically be provincial. This is in fact a very special type of provincial furniture called port furniture, referring to the sophisticated pieces made in major port cities from the late 17th to the early 19th centuries. And the key port was Bordeaux, and many of the best pieces seem to have been made in solid mahogany from 1750 to 1806, after which Napoleon had imposed a continental embargo that restricted access to this rare wood. But with that covered, we see here how much of the decor comes from the rich color and the quality of this wood, with this grain pattern that flows symmetrically downward matched on both of the panels, and with these massive grow rings from a mahogany tree that grew 250 years ago and which itself had probably been growing since the 1500s. And so it's actually the quality, the color, its aptitude for being polished and for holding crisp carvings that allowed Bordelaise makers to neglect other decorative techniques like inlay and marquetry on even the finest Bordelaise pieces. But anyway, we see how one of the first criteria for collectability on any armoire is going to be the quality of the wood, followed by the artistry with which the sculpture is conceived and executed, and then even followed by the size of the piece. Because much of the point here is the impressive architecture, and that's why the most luxurious models tend to be about 3 meters tall. But again, we have to look past this and demand a certain completeness of decor. The decor on this one is predominantly expressed in this mid-18th century curvilinear French style, this movement-driven Louis XV style as it's called, also known as Rococo, for rocky or uneven ground, as this style is one that brings the beauty of nature, the force and the movement of nature indoors. And we're going to see a certain completeness in the thorough scrolling of this panel and its moldings, the complexity of which is going to be less pronounced on less artful models of armoires. And if we take a look at the moldings here, we actually see that they're comprised of several sculpted lines which catch the light differently and which add a lot of depth and contrast to what would otherwise be a single sculpted line. Next, let's look at the simulated movement of these moldings above that collide and scroll apart, with this one seeming to displace the shape of that panel downwards with its motion. And then the doors soar upwards as if pulled by the upper cornice, the space under which we appreciate was not left blank, but rather completed with a band of Rococo sculpture centered by a shell. And this sculpture is reflected at the bottom of the piece by this traverse which scrolls and descends into the pieds escargots, or the snail-shaped feet. And this scrolling traverse is continued along the sides of the piece, which are not as decorated as the front, but we notice how on the highest quality armoires, some care is always taken to decorate the sides. And midway up here, we actually see a frieze of fluting that continues the fluting that we see decorating the center of the piece. Now, this is the one element of neoclassical decor here, like the flutings on an ancient classical column. But here, this touch has been aligned with the overall curvilinear style of the piece. And the flutings between the doors are redentées, which just means that there's a convex flute that rises back up to the level of the keyholes. And that's just a small detail of quality. But overall, we see that the design is complete and sophisticated, and that these moldings here are very complex, with a wide one that descends into a smaller cylindrical one that wraps around to a lip before a wide recession, and then another lip to another molding, which itself curves into a sharp angle, another cylindrical molding before another recession, two lips, and then the center panel. And the point here is that if you start removing a number of those moldings, some of these extra lines, some of these details of quality, these elements of sculpture, certainly you remove some of the original cost of this piece for the owner 240 years ago, but you also remove some of the importance of this piece as an emblematic one, as a work of art today. And so that's what I mean by looking past the impressive size of these pieces into these details of quality, which are only present on a select few. Now for the inside of the piece, the next thing that we look for on these emblematic period armoires of relatively outstanding design is the presence of original metalwork, which luckily for us was a Bordelaise specialty. So as we open the doors, let's just glance at this impressive hinge which spans the height of both doors, each of which weighs about 120 pounds. So the hinges need to be very serious, but we see here that this hinge, by the very nature of its quality, is also adding decor and furthering the exceptional nature of this entire object. Now we see that it retains the original key and that the keyhole entry plates are open-worked in the Bordelaise fashion. Now the key is a little torqued, probably from the pressure of working the impressive five-pointed lock inside, which also spans the height of the doors. And this lock, in and of itself, is a work of art that functions. And we see here how it allows for even the lock to be, again, a deepening of the overall exceptional nature of this piece. Because furniture from this time was about quality over quantity, and both makers and buyers understood that these pieces were exceptional, and they didn't appreciate them in a way that really resembles the way we tend to think of furniture today. But we see that this lock does decorate the inner doors, as they would often be left open to display silverware or porcelain. And that's why they're finished, not polished, and that's also why we see some holes, probably left from the candelabra that used to be mounted here. Talk about a fire hazard. And now the other door has also retained its original locking mechanism, which operates by pushing an ornate knob forward, geared to retract the locking bars. And this piece is equivalent to several which are published, including one conserved in the Château de la Croix-David, probably from the same workshop. So it would present an interest to collectors regardless of its state of conservation. But now that we've seen these elements, we understand what a shame it would be for this original metalwork to be missing. And now we've arrived at the final criteria for collectability, which is less important and which this piece does, in fact, seem to miss, and it's the presence of original shelving. The top one here might be original, and we see how it features a molded edge. Now the replacement shelves have been improperly waxed the wrong color by me to add insult to injury, but that's a common thing to find replacement shelves inside of these pieces, although this would have originally featured a shelf of drawers, and then the best Bordelaise pieces would in fact, not too dissimilar from this piece, but the best ones, although this is very rare, would actually feature a built-in chest of drawers, so that now you have the full story. But now finally, on a pragmatic note, I am often asked how one reaches the upper shelf of such an armoire. And this question does sort of negate the overarching purpose of these pieces, which is just to be glorious. But I will respond, because you simply need an Obama period bar stool here to have safe and fun access to the upper shelf of this grandiose armoire. And so, with all that being said, I think we've pretty well covered this subject, and we've certainly preserved a digital trace of the excellence of Bordelaise furniture making, and I really do hope that you've enjoyed taking a closer look at it. But this is really not a benchmark against which to judge all Bordelaise pieces from this time, but it really is an iconic example of this special type of furniture pertinent to understanding armoires as a collector. Now, of course, there are many other types of armoires from different periods to consider, but with this one, we've covered the most iconic model, this monumental 18th century one with two doors and a cornice in the shape of a policeman's hat, en forme de chapeau de gendarme. Unfortunately, policemen no longer wear such hats. But there really is no other piece more common to encounter in an old Bordelaise family than such an armoire, made by one of these port masters who would have been a little more sophisticated than his inland counterparts, simply because he lived in a port and he had access to new ideas. But if we can't say for certain that the original owner owned ships, they certainly saw ships that were departing for this new American continent. And I think that they would be very amused to know that their piece has now been the subject of a video 240 years later on the other side of the sea.